In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets whisper through the hedgerows and every neighbour knows more than they let on, Miss Jane Marple sits by her window, knitting and observing the subtle ripples of human nature. When an invitation arrives from the enigmatic Dusthaven Manor, Miss Marple is drawn into a mystery where a cryptic clue, etched in dust, unravels a web of deceit, betrayal, and long-buried truths. Set in the charming yet deceptive world of 1930s England, this tale promises a labyrinth of motives, sharp dialogue, and a final twist that will leave you breathless. Chapter 1. The tranquil village of St. Mary Mead. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, painting the cobblestone paths and thatched cottages with a warmth that belied the crisp autumn air. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favourite armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the village's comings and goings. To the untrained eye, St. Mary Mead was a picture of tranquillity. Children played in the lane, Mrs. Price bustled toward the post office, and the vicar's bicycle wobbled past the bakery. But to Miss Marple, every glance, every hurried step, told a story, and stories, she knew, often hid darker truths. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp rap of the postman's knock. "A letter for you, Miss Marple," called young Tommy, his freckled face peering through the door. She smiled, setting her knitting aside, and accepted the cream-coloured envelope with curiosity. The paper was heavy, embossed with a crest she didn't recognize, a griffin clutching a quill. The address read, Dusthaven Manor, Ashbourne Vale. "From whom, I wonder?" Miss Marple murmured, slicing the envelope open with a silver letter opener. The letter was penned in an elegant, looping hand. "Dear Miss Marple, your reputation for discernment precedes you. I am hosting a small gathering at Dusthaven Manor this weekend and would be honoured by your presence. Certain matters require a keen mind, and I believe you may find the occasion illuminating. Enclosed are travel arrangements. I trust you will join us. Yours sincerely, Lady Evelyn Harcourt." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. A Lady Harcourt's name was unfamiliar, and Ashbourne Vale was a good 2 hours by train from St. Mary Mead. The letter's tone was polite but cryptic, with an undercurrent of urgency that piqued her curiosity. She glanced at the enclosed ticket, a first-class fare for Saturday morning, and a small map to the manor. "Curious," she said softly, tapping the letter against her palm. "Very curious indeed." The rest of the day passed in quiet routine, but Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. She recalled snippets of village gossip about Ashbourne Vale, a place rarely mentioned but tinged with whispers of old scandals and reclusive families. By evening, as she sipped her tea, she resolved to attend. After all, she thought, a change of scenery might do her good, and mysteries like weeds had a way of sprouting in the most unexpected places. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the vicarage to inform her friend, the Reverend Clement, of her impending trip. "Dusthaven Manor, you say?" he remarked, adjusting his spectacles. "I've heard it's a grand old place, but the Harcourts keep to themselves. Something about a family tragedy years ago, though I can't recall the details." "Tragedies have a way of lingering," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "I shall see what I can learn." As Saturday dawned, Miss Marple packed a modest suitcase, tucking in her knitting and a small notebook. The train journey to Ashbourne Vale was pleasant, the countryside rolling past in a patchwork of greens and golds. She arrived at the small station by noon, where a sleek black car awaited her, driven by a taciturn man in a chauffeur's cap. The drive to Dusthaven Manor wound through dense woods, the road narrowing as the manor's silhouette emerged against the sky, a sprawling, ivy-clad structure with tall chimneys and arched windows. It was beautiful, Miss Marple thought, but there was something sombre about it, as if the stones themselves held secrets. At the manor's entrance, a butler, with a severe expression, ushered her inside. The hall was grand, with polished oak floors and a chandelier that glittered faintly in the daylight. Lady Evelyn Harcourt greeted her, a tall woman in her 50s with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to weigh every word. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come," she said, her voice smooth but guarded. "I hope you'll find our little gathering enlightening." The other guests were already assembled in the drawing-room. Dr. Lionel Graves, a retired physician with a nervous twitch, Miss Clara Wentworth, a sharp-tongued novelist, Mr. Rupert Langley, a young barrister with an overly charming smile, and Mrs. Beatrice Langley, his quiet, watchful wife. There was also a distant cousin, Mr. Felix Harcourt, whose fidgety manner suggested he'd rather be elsewhere. As introductions were made, Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the undercurrents, the way Clara's smile didn't reach her eyes when she greeted Rupert, or how Felix avoided Lady Evelyn's gaze. Tea was served, and conversation turned to polite trivialities, but Miss Marple sensed a tension in the room, like a taut string waiting to snap. That evening, as the guests retired to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, her fingers brushing the banister. She paused by a large window overlooking the garden, where moonlight illuminated a stone fountain. Something about the manor felt alive. Watchful. She smiled faintly. "A puzzle," she whispered to herself, "and every puzzle has a solution." What did you think of the first chapter of Miss Marple and the clue etched in dust? Where are you reading from? Perhaps a cozy village like St. Mary Mead, or a bustling city? Drop your location in the comments below and let me know what you think is brewing at Dusthaven Manor. Don't forget to subscribe for the next chapter and join Miss Marple as she unravels this captivating mystery. Chapter 2. An Invitation to Dusthaven Manor. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Dusthaven Manor, casting dappled light across the breakfast room. Miss Jane Marple sat at the polished mahogany table, her hands folded neatly over her napkin, observing the other guests with the quiet attentiveness of a cat watching a garden. The air was thick with the scent of toast and coffee, but beneath the pleasantries, a current of unease rippled through the room. Lady Evelyn Harcourt presided over the table, her demeanor as composed as ever, though Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her jaw when Mr. Felix Harcourt reached for the marmalade. Lionel Graves muttered about the weather, his fingers twitching around his teacup, while Miss Clara Wentworth, the novelist, scribbled furiously in a small notebook, her eyes darting toward Rupert Langley. Rupert, in turn, flashed his charming smile at everyone except his wife, Beatrice, who sat silently, her gaze fixed on her untouched plate. "Miss Marple," Lady Evelyn said, breaking the silence, "I trust you slept well." "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. "The manor is charming, though I dare say it has its secrets." Clara's pen paused, and Felix coughed into his napkin. Lady Evelyn Nister's smile was a touch too sharp. "All old houses have secrets," she said, "but I assure you ours are harmless." Miss Marple inclined her head, saying nothing. She had learned long ago that silence often coaxed more truths than questions. After breakfast, Lady Evelyn invited the guests to the library for what she called a small matter of interest. The library was a grand room, its walls lined with leather-bound books, and a massive fireplace that stood cold and unlit. A long table dominated the center, and on it lay a peculiar object, a silver cigarette case, its surface etched with intricate patterns. Beside it was a small card with a single word written in bold ink: Truth. "This," Lady Evelyn announced, her voice carrying a hint of theatricality, "belonged to my late brother, Sir Reginald Harcourt. It was found in the attic last week, along with this card. I believe it holds significance, though I confess I don't know what." Dr. Graves peered at the case, his brow furrowing. Odd thing to leave lying about. Was Sir Reginald fond of riddles? "Very much so," Lady Evelyn said, her eyes flickering to Felix. "He was eccentric." Felix shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming on the table. "Aunt Evelyn, surely this is just some old trinket. Why make a fuss?" "Because," Clara interjected, her voice sharp, "it sits clearly more than that. Look at the etching. Those aren't random scratches. They form a pattern, perhaps a message." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the case. The etchings were indeed deliberate, a series of lines and curves that seemed to form a crude map or diagram. "Curious," she murmured. "Might I take a closer look?" Lady Evelyn nodded, and Miss Marple lifted the case, her fingers tracing the lines. They were faint, as if scratched in haste, and dusted with a fine layer of grime. She rubbed her thumb across the surface, revealing a clearer outline. "It appears to be a floor plan," she said softly. "Perhaps of this very house." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Rupert frowned, leaning closer. "A floor plan? Why would anyone etch that into a cigarette case?" "Perhaps to hide something," Miss Marple said, her tone deceptively mild, "or to point to something hidden." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. Lady Evelyn's expression remained unreadable, but her eyes gleamed with something Miss Marple couldn't quite place, anticipation perhaps, or fear. The rest of the morning passed in strained conversation, with the guests dispersing to explore the manor's grounds. Miss Marple, however, lingered in the library, her knitting in her lap, as she studied the cigarette case. She had seen many puzzles in her time, but this one felt different, personal, almost. The word truth on the card nagged at her. It was a challenge, she thought, or perhaps a warning. As she sat, the butler entered, his face pale. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "Lady Evelyn requests your presence in the drawing-room. There's been an incident." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her heart quickening. "An incident?" "Yes, ma. Stay," he said, his eyes darting to the cigarette case. "It's Mr. Felix. He's unwell." She rose, tucking the case into her handbag. As she followed the butler, she couldn't shake the feeling that the manor's secrets were beginning to stir, like dust disturbed by a sudden breeze. Chapter 3. The Arrival and the Gathering Storm. Miss Marple followed the butler through the winding corridors of Dusthaven Manor, her steps light but purposeful. The air grew heavier as they approached the drawing-room, where a low murmur of voices spilled through the half-open door. She paused at the threshold, her sharp eyes taking in the scene before entering. Felix Harcourt lay sprawled on a velvet settee, his face pale and beaded with sweat. Lady Evelyn stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly, while Dr. Graves knelt beside Felix, loosening his collar. Clara Wentworth hovered by the fireplace, her notebook clutched to her chest, and Rupert Langley stood at the window, his back to the room. Beatrice, his wife, sat in a corner, her fingers twisting a handkerchief into knots. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but firm. Dr. Graves glanced up, his expression grim. He collapsed just after luncheon, complained of dizziness, then went down like a sack of potatoes. I've given him a mild sedative, but he needs rest. Rest, Clara snapped, her eyes flashing. He was perfectly fine this morning. What could have caused this? Perhaps he ate something disagreeable, Rupert suggested, turning from the window with a forced smile. The fish at lunch was rather pungent. Nonsense, Lady Evelyn said sharply. The food here is impeccable. Felix has always been delicate. Heaven set you, Felix. Felix groaned, his eyes fluttering open. I don't know what happened, he mumbled. Felt like the room was spinning, and then nothing. Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze settling on Felix Setst's trembling hands. Did you notice anything unusual before you felt ill, Mr. Harcourt? A taste, a smell, perhaps? He shook his head weakly. Just the library. That damned cigarette case. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The room stilled. Lady Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, and Clara's pen scratched furiously in her notebook. Miss Marple noted the reactions, filing them away like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Perhaps we should all retire for a bit, Miss Marple suggested gently. A shock like this can unsettle the nerves. The group dispersed reluctantly, but Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the drawing room. The space was elegant, with high ceilings and heavy drapes, but something felt off. Her gaze fell on a small side table near the settee, where a glass of water sat, its surface faintly clouded. She made a mental note to inquire about it later. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple took a walk through the manor's grounds, her shawl wrapped tightly against the chill. The gardens were meticulously kept, with rose bushes and gravel paths, but the air carried a sense of neglect, as if the beauty was a facade. She paused by a stone bench, where Beatrice Langley sat alone, her face pale. "Mrs. Langley," Miss Marple said, sitting beside her, "you seem troubled. Is there something you like to share?" Beatrice started, her eyes wide. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's just this. It's so grand, but it feels like a cage. And Felix, do you think he was poisoned?" The word hung between them, sharp and heavy. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild. "Poison is a strong word, my dear, but sudden illness does raise questions. Have you noticed anything odd since you arrived?" Beatrice hesitated, then leaned closer. "Last night, I saw Clara in the hall near Felix Sitz's room. She was holding something small, shiny. I couldn't quite see, but she looked furtive." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning. "Thank you, Mrs. Langley. You been most helpful." As Beatrice hurried back to the manor, Miss Marple remained on the bench, her fingers tracing the edge of her shawl. Clara Wentworth, with her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, was a woman who noticed details, perhaps too many, and the cigarette case, with its etched map, seemed to be at the heart of this growing unease. By evening, the atmosphere in Dusthaven Manor had thickened, like a storm brewing on the horizon. At dinner the conversation was stilted, with glances darting like arrows. Lady Evelyn announced that the cigarette case would remain in the library under lock and key until its significance was understood. "For safety," she said, her eyes sweeping the table. Miss Marple sipped her soup, her thoughts elsewhere. Felix's collapse, the clouded glass, Beatrice's whisper about Clara, each was a thread in a tapestry she was beginning to weave. As she retired to her room that night, she opened her notebook and jotted down a single word. The storm was coming, she thought, and when it broke, the truth would not be far behind. Chapter 4. The Etched Clue in the Library. The morning after Felix's collapse dawned grey and heavy, with clouds pressing low over Dusthaven Manor. Miss Jane Marple rose early, her mind already turning over the events of the previous day. She dressed in her usual sensible attire, a grey tweed skirt, a crisp blouse, and a lavender cardigan, before making her way to the library. The cigarette case, with its enigmatic etchings, had become a lodestone, drawing her thoughts like a magnet. She was determined to examine it again, certain it held the key to the manor's restless atmosphere. The library was silent when she entered, save for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. The air smelled of old leather and wax polish, and the tall windows admitted only a dim, filtered light. The cigarette case sat on the table, now secured in a glass box with a small brass lock, as Lady Evelyn had promised. Miss Marple approached, her eyes narrowing as she studied the etched lines through the glass. The pattern was clearer now, after her gentle cleaning the day before, a series of intersecting lines that suggested a floor plan, with a distinct X marking one corner. "Curiouser and curiouser," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She reached into her handbag, retrieving a small magnifying glass she always carried for such occasions. Leaning closer, she traced the lines with her gaze, noting how they corresponded to the manor's layout. The long corridor, the drawing room, the staircase. The X, she suspected, marked a specific room, or perhaps something hidden within it. Her concentration was broken by the sound of footsteps, or Rupert Langley entered, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. "Miss Marple," he said, his smile as charming as ever, though it faltered slightly under her steady gaze. "Up early, I see. Still fascinated by that old trinket." "It says more than a trinket, Mr. Langley," she replied, her tone mild. "It says a puzzle, and puzzles often lead to unexpected places. Don't said you agree." Rupert chuckled, but there was a nervous edge to it. "I suppose so. Though I stetched wager it. Stet's just some old family nonsense. Sir Reginald was a bit of a character, from what I heard." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her eyes returning to the case, "but characters often leave legacies that outlive them." Rupert lingered, his fingers drumming on the table. "You sit a sharp one, Anne, sit you. Lady Evelyn was right to invite you. She seems to think you sit'll unravel whatever this is." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Lady Evelyn is a perceptive woman. Tell me, Mr. Langley, how well do you know the Harcourt family?" He shrugged, his smile tightening. "Not well. Beatrice is a distant cousin, so I've met them a few times. Felix is a bit of a wet blanket, but Evelyn runs the show, always has." "And Sir Reginald?" she pressed gently. Rupert hesitated, his eyes flicking to the cigarette case. "Died years ago, didn't he? Some accident in the woods. Never met the man myself." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away his words. Rupert Sictor's casual demeanor was practiced, she thought, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. She made a mental note to inquire further about Sir Reginald Sictor's accident. As Rupert excused himself, claiming a need for fresh air, Miss Marple remained in the library, sketching the etched pattern in her notebook. She was interrupted again by the arrival of Clara Wentworth, her sharp features softened by the morning light, but her eyes as piercing as ever. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice laced with curiosity, "you set quite taken with that case. Do you think it's set really a map?" "I believe so," Miss Marple replied, closing her notebook, "but maps are only useful if you know what you set's looking for. Have you any thoughts, Miss Wentworth?" Clara Sit's lips curled into a wry smile. "I stim a writer, Miss Marple. I see stories everywhere, and this one reeks of intrigue. It stips practically begging to be investigated." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "though I wonder if the story is one of greed, revenge, or something else entirely." Clara Sit's smile faltered, and she busied herself with straightening her scarf. "You have a way of making one feel transparent," she said lightly. "I Sit'll leave you to your sleuthing." Alone again, Miss Marple continued her examination, her thoughts drifting to Felix's collapse. The clouded glass of water nagged at her, as did Beatrice's whispered suspicion about Clara. Poison was a possibility, though she hesitated to leap to conclusions. She recalled a similar incident in St. Paul, Mary Mead, where a young man's sudden illness had been traced to a mislabeled bottle in the chemist's shop. But here, in Dusthaven Manor, the stakes felt higher, the motives murkier. By midday, the guests gathered for luncheon, but the atmosphere was strained. Felix, though recovered, was pale and quiet, avoiding eye contact with Lady Evelyn. Dr. Graves muttered about the damp weather, aggravating his rheumatism, while Beatrice picked at her food, her eyes darting nervously. Rupert, ever the charmer, tried to lighten the mood with anecdotes, but his laughter rang hollow. After luncheon, Miss Marple requested a private word with Lady Evelyn, who led her to a small parlour overlooking the rose garden. The room was cosy, with chintz curtains and a crackling fire, but Lady Evelyn's posture was rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You wished to speak, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice cool but curious. "Yes," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "I couldn't help but notice the tension among your guests, and Mr. Felix Sit's illness yesterday was most unsettling. Might I ask about Sir Reginald Sit's death? It seems to loom over this house." Lady Evelyn Sit's face tightened, but she met Miss Marple Sit's gaze. "My brother died 15 years ago in a hunting accident. A misfired rifle," they said. "It was a tragedy, but hardly relevant now. Yet his cigarette case appears at the center of this gathering," Miss Marple said gently, "and the word truth suggests someone wishes to revisit the past." Lady Evelyn Sit's eyes flickered, but she remained composed. Reginald was fond of games. He left behind many such curiosities. "I invited you here because I trust your discretion, Miss Marple. If there sits a puzzle to be solved, I believe you Sit'll find it." Miss Marple nodded, sensing the conversation was at an end. As she left the parlour, she felt the weight of Lady Evelyn's words. The cigarette case was no mere curiosity. It was a challenge, a thread that, if pulled, might unravel the manor's carefully guarded secrets. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the library, determined to test her theory about the etched map. She compared her sketch to the manor's layout, noting that the X corresponded to a room on the second floor, a guest bedroom perhaps, or a study. Slipping upstairs, she found the room in question, a small, dusty study with a locked desk and faded wallpaper. The air was stale, as if untouched for years. Using a hairpin from her handbag, Miss Marple deftly picked the desk's lock, a skill she'd learned from a rather disreputable nephew years ago. Inside, she found a bundle of letters, yellowed with age, tied with a faded ribbon. The topmost letter bore a single line in a shaky hand. "The truth lies where the dust settles." Her pulse quickened. The words echoed the card from the cigarette case, and the handwriting was unmistakably similar. As she tucked the letters into her handbag, she heard a creak outside the door. She froze, her heart steady but alert. Someone was watching, she was certain, and the game, it seemed, was only just beginning. Chapter 5. Whispers of Suspicion. The creak outside the study door lingered in Miss Marple's ears as she stood motionless, her hand still resting on the bundle of letters she had found in the desk. The air in the small, dusty room felt charged, as if the manor itself were holding its breath. She slipped the letters deeper into her handbag, her movements deliberate but unhurried, and stepped toward the door. Opening it slowly, she peered into the dimly lit corridor. It was empty, save for the faint flicker of a sconce at the far end. Yet the sense of being watched prickled at the back of her neck, a sensation she had learned to trust over years of unraveling human mysteries. Miss Marple descended the staircase, her sensible shoes silent on the thick carpet. The manor was quiet, the other guests presumably occupied with their own pursuits, but she knew better than to assume idleness. People, she had observed, were rarely as idle as they appeared, especially in a house like Dusthaven, where every glance and gesture seemed laden with meaning. In the drawing-room, she found Clara Wentworth perched on a sofa, her notebook open, but her pen idle. The novelist's sharp eyes flicked up as Miss Marple entered, and a faint smile played on her lips. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her tone teasing, "you've been exploring, haven't you? I saw you slip upstairs. Found anything interesting?" Miss Marple settled into an armchair, her expression serene. "Only dust and cobwebs, Miss Wentworth. Old houses are full of them. Are they not?" Clara's smile widened, but there was a calculating glint in her eyes. "Dust, yes. But sometimes it hides treasures or secrets. You strike me as someone who knows the difference." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft. "And you, as a writer, must have a keen eye for secrets. Have you noticed anything unusual among our fellow guests?" Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, plenty. Rupert's charm is as polished as a stage actor's, but he watches Beatrice like a hawk. And Beatrice. She's quiet, but I'd wager she's hiding something. Then there's Felix, always twitching like a cornered mouse. And Lady Evelyn." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "She's playing a game, I think. This whole gathering feels like one of her brother's riddles." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers smoothing the edge of her shawl. "A game indeed, and games have rules, even if they stir not immediately clear." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Graves, his face flushed from a brisk walk in the gardens. "Ladies," he said, nodding curtly, "I hope I am not intruding. Just needed a moment, sit's respite from the damp air out there." "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her eyes studying his nervous twitch. "How is Mr. Felix faring today?" Dr. Graves hesitated, his fingers fumbling with his watch chain. "Better, I think. Weak, but stable. I advised him to avoid exertion. Though, I must say, this house doesn't sect help. Too many shadows, too much history. History can be illuminating, Miss Marple said mildly, especially when it leaves clues behind. Dr. Graveset's eyes darted to her, then away. Clues? You mean that cigarette case? A lot of fuss over nothing, if you ask me. Clara snorted softly. Nothing? It's Sal's practically screaming to be deciphered. Done. Said you find it odd, Doctor, that it turned up now, after all these years. I don't speculate on such things, Dr. Graves said stiffly. My concern is Felix's sister's health, not some old family relic. Miss Marple noted the defensiveness in his tone, the way his hands clenched briefly before relaxing. She changed the subject, asking about the weather, and Dr. Graves seemed relieved to lapse into small talk. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over Clara's observations and the letters in her handbag. She needed time to read them, but privacy was scarce in a house full of watchful eyes. That evening, dinner was a tense affair. Lady Evelyn presided with her usual poise, but the conversation faltered, punctuated by awkward silences. Felix, though present, ate little, his eyes darting nervously to the cigarette case, now returned to its glass box on a sideboard. Rupert tried to lighten the mood with a story about a London barrister, but even his charm couldn't dispel the unease. Beatrice, sitting beside him, barely spoke, her fingers shredding a napkin into tiny pieces. After dinner, Miss Marple excused herself to her room, claiming a need for rest. But once alone, she locked the door and drew the letters from her handbag. There were 5 in total, each written in the same shaky hand as the note on the cigarette case. The first began, "My dearest Evelyn, I fear I have stumbled upon something I cannot unsee. The truth lies where the dust settles, but it is a dangerous truth. If anything should happen to me, look to the heart of the manor. The answers are there, hidden, in plain sight." The letter was unsigned, but Miss Marple was certain it was from Sir Reginald. The others were similarly cryptic, hinting at a betrayal within the family, and a secret tied to the manor's history. One mentioned a locked room and a key lost to time, while another warned of eyes that see too much. The final letter was the shortest, a single line. "Forgive me, but I cannot keep silent any longer." Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing. Sir Reginald's death, dismissed as an accident, was beginning to look like something else entirely. The cigarette case, the letters, Felix's collapse, all were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a long-buried truth. But whose truth, and who was desperate to keep it hidden? A soft knock at her door startled her. She tucked the letters away and opened it to find Beatrice, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing down the corridor. "I need to speak with you, alone." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, ushering her inside. "What's troubling you?" Beatrice wrung her hands, her voice trembling. "It's Rupert. I overheard him talking to someone in the garden this afternoon. I couldn't see who, but he said, sit. If the old woman figures it out, we done for." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained gentle. "Did he now? And what else did he say?" Beatrice shook her head. "That was all I heard before they moved out of earshot. But I am frightened, Miss Marple. This place, it sits not safe. And that cigarette case, it sits like it sits cursed." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said firmly, though her mind was already turning over this new information. "Curses are merely secrets dressed up in superstition. Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Langley. Now, Try to rest, and say nothing of this to anyone." Beatrice nodded, her relief palpable, and slipped out of the room. Miss Marple locked the door behind her, her thoughts swirling. Rupert's words suggested a conspiracy. But with whom? And why was he so concerned about her? She recalled a similar situation in St. Mary Mead, where a whispered conversation had unravelled a scheme of blackmail. But here the stakes felt higher, the players more cunning. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple glanced at the window, where the moon cast long shadows across the floor. The manor was alive with secrets, she thought, and each whisper brought her closer to the truth. But whispers could be dangerous, and she would need to tread carefully if she was to avoid becoming a target herself. Chapter 6: Interrogations over Tea. The following morning brought a rare burst of sunlight to Dusthaven Manor, piercing through the heavy clouds and illuminating the breakfast room in a way that almost dispelled the lingering shadows of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple entered the room with her customary poise, her lavender cardigan neatly buttoned and her handbag tucked under her arm. The letters from Sir Reginald were safely hidden within it, their cryptic warnings echoing in her mind like distant thunder. She had spent much of the night pondering their implications, drawing parallels to cases from her village life where family secrets had festered like untreated wounds. The guests were already assembled, though the table bore signs of a hurried meal, half-eaten toast and cooling coffee cups, suggesting appetites dulled by unease. Lady Evelyn sat at the head, her posture impeccable, but her eyes shadowed with fatigue. Felix picked at his eggs, his colour improved, but his manner still jittery. Dr. Graves grumbled about his rheumatism, while Clara Wentworth observed everyone with the keen interest of a novelist plotting her next chapter. Rupert Langley, ever the picture of composure, poured tea with a steady hand, though Miss Marple noted the subtle tension in his shoulders. Beatrice, seated beside him, avoided his gaze, her fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Lady Evelyn said, her voice carrying a forced brightness. "I trust you slept well?" "As well as one can in such an intriguing house," Miss Marple replied, taking her seat and accepting a cup of tea from Rupert. Thank you, Mr. Langley. You set quite adept with the teapot." Rupert flashed his charming smile. "A barrister learns to handle delicate matters, Miss Marple. Tea is the least of them." She nodded, sipping her tea thoughtfully. It was the perfect opportunity. She decided to steer the conversation toward the heart of the mystery. Tea, after all, had a way of loosening tongues, much like the afternoon gatherings in St. Mary Mead, where gossip flowed as freely as the Earl Grey. "Lady Evelyn," Miss Marple began, her tone conversational, "I set been thinking about your brother Sit's cigarette case. It sets quite a remarkable piece. Might I ask how it came to be discovered in the attic after all these years?" Lady Evelyn Sett's cup paused midway to her lips, but she recovered smoothly. "One of the maids found it while clearing out old boxes. Reginald was always misplacing things. It sits no surprise, it turned up now." Felix shifted in his seat, his fork clattering against his plate. "Aunt Evelyn, must we discuss this at breakfast? It sounds bad for the digestion." "Nonsense, Felix," Clara interjected, her eyes gleaming. "It sets fascinating, and that etching clearly a map. Have you explored where it leads, Lady Evelyn?" Lady Evelyn set her cup down with a soft clink. "I said glanced at it, but I said no cartographer. If it sets a map, it sets likely to one of Reginald Set's silly hiding spots. He loved his games." Dr. Graves cleared his throat, his twitch more pronounced. Games can be dangerous. Remember that case in the papers last year? A man hid his will in a puzzle box, and his heirs nearly killed each other over it. Miss Marple Sipter's eyes sparkled behind her spectacles. How astute, Doctor. And speaking of heirs, Mr. Felix, you were close to your uncle, weren't you? Did he ever share his riddles with you? Felix flushed, his eyes darting to Lady Evelyn. Uncle Reginald? Not particularly. He was eccentric, preferred his solitude. Solitude can breed secrets, Miss Marple said mildly, turning to Beatrice. Mrs. Langley, as a distant cousin, did you know Sir Reginald well? Beatrice hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. Not really. I visited once as a child. He was kind, but distant, always scribbling in his notebooks. Rupert placed a hand on his wife Sit's arm, his touch lingering a fraction too long. Beatrice doesn't sit like dwelling on the past. Miss Marple, it sits not healthy. Yet the past has a way of intruding on the present, Miss Marple countered gently. Especially when it involves an sick accident sets, like Sir Reginald sets. Hunting mishaps are tragic, but sometimes questionable. The room fell silent, the clink of silverware ceasing as all eyes turned to her. Lady Evelyn Sed's face paled, but her voice remained steady. What are you implying, Miss Marple? Nothing untoward, Miss Marple said, her tone innocent. Merely that accidents can mask other intentions. In my village, a similar incident turned out to be a dispute over inheritance. Clara leaned forward, her notebook appearing as if by magic. Inheritance. Now that Sip's a motive worth exploring. Sir Reginald was wealthy, wasn't Sithy, who benefited from his death. Lady Evelyn Stitt's eyes flashed with irritation. This is hardly appropriate conversation. Reginald Stitt's will was straightforward. I inherited the manor, and Felix received a trust fund. There was no foul play. Felix pushed his plate away, his face ashen. I don't set like this talk. It sets upsetting. Dr. Graves nodded vigorously. Quite right. We sit here as guests, not inquisitors. Miss Marple smiled faintly, undeterred. Forgive me, I have a habit of pondering human nature. It sits like knitting. A loose thread can unravel the whole pattern. The breakfast concluded awkwardly, with the guests dispersing quickly. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes following each one. Rupert and Beatrice headed to the garden, their heads close in whispered conversation. Clara slipped away to the library, notebook in hand. Felix retired to his room, claiming a headache, while Dr. Graves announced a walk to clear his mind. Lady Evelyn remained, her gaze meeting Miss Marple's with a mix of challenge and curiosity. You still quite the observer, Miss Marple, she said once they were alone. But be careful. Not all threads lead where you expect. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, but they always lead somewhere. Leaving the breakfast room, Miss Marple made her way to the garden, where she found Rupert and Beatrice seated on a bench near the rosebushes. The air was fragrant with blooms, but the couple's expressions were tense. She approached quietly, her presence announced by the crunch of gravel. "May I join you?" she asked, settling beside them without waiting for an answer. Such a lovely spot, though I imagine it holds memories for the family. Beatrice nodded, her eyes downcast. Yes, Sir Reginald loved the roses. He planted many himself. Rupert Sit's smile was strained. What brings you out here, Miss Marple? More questions. Just a few, she said, her voice soft. Mr. Langley, you mentioned being a barrister. Have you handled many cases involving estates or accidents? Rupert's eyes narrowed slightly. A few. Why do you ask? Because accidents can be convenient, Miss Marple said, especially if there's sects or will involved. Did you know Sir Reginald well? Not at all, Rupert admitted. I met Beatrice after his death, but I heard the stories. Brilliant man, tragic end. Beatrice fidgeted, her hands twisting in her lap. Rupert, perhaps we should... No, let's hear her out, Rupert said, his tone sharpening. You seem to think there's more to this than meets the eye, Miss Marple. Care to share your theories? Miss Marple shook her head. Theories are like half-finished scarves, useless until complete. But I will say this, secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when prodded. As she rose to leave, Beatrice caught her sleeve. Miss Marple, be careful. Some secrets are better left buried. Miss Marple patted her hand gently. My dear, buried secrets tend to grow roots that trip us all. Returning to the manor, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Graves in the hall, his coat dusted with pollen from his walk. Doctor, she said, a word about Felix Sist's illness. You treated him promptly. Have you considered external causes? Dr. Graves sepsed. Twitch intensified. External? You mean poison? Preposterous. It was likely indigestion or nerves. Or perhaps something in his water glass, Miss Marple suggested. I noticed it was clouded. He stared at her, then sighed. Very well. I did test it discreetly, traces of a sedative, nothing lethal. But who would do such a thing? That, doctor, is the question, Miss Marple said. Her final interrogation of the morning was with Clara, whom she found in the library, poring over the cigarette case through its glass enclosure. Miss Wentworth, Miss Marple said, you have a writer's eye for detail. What do you make of the etching? Clara looked up, her expression eager. It's a map to the study upstairs. I'm sure. I sneaked a look yesterday, found an old desk, but it was locked. Miss Marple suppressed a smile. Locked doors invite curiosity. And what of the guests? Any suspicions? Clara grinned. All of them. Rupert sits too smooth, Beatrice too meek, Felix too weak, Graves too twitchy, and Evelyn, she sits hiding something big. Perceptive, Miss Marple said, but perception can be a double-edged sword. As the afternoon approached, Miss Marple retired to her room to reflect. The interrogations had yielded threads, motives of inheritance, hints of poison, whispers of conspiracy. The letters burned in her mind, their warnings clear. The truth was dangerous, but Miss Marple was undaunted. Like a skilled knitter, she would weave these threads into a coherent pattern, revealing the culprit before the web ensnared them all. Chapter 7. Shadows. From the past. The afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting elongated shadows across the manicured lawns of Dusthaven Manor. Miss Jane Marple sat in the conservatory, a room filled with potted ferns and wicker furniture that offered a view of the garden paths. Her knitting needles clicked steadily, a rhythmic counterpoint to the turmoil of thoughts swirling in her mind. The interrogations over tea had revealed cracks in the guests' facades, like fine lines in old porcelain, hinting at deeper fractures beneath. The letters from Sir Reginald with their veiled warnings suggested a shadow from the past that loomed over the present, threatening to engulf them all. She had decided to delve deeper into the manor's history, convinced that understanding Sir Reginald's life and death would illuminate the current mysteries. Excusing herself from the group, she sought out the butler, Mr. Hargrove, a stoic figure who had served the Harcourt family for decades. She found him in the pantry, polishing silver with meticulous care. "Mr. Hargrove," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but insistent, "might I have a moment of your time? I'm curious about the history of Dusthaven Manor." The butler paused, his cloth hovering over a gleaming tray. His face, lined with years of service, betrayed a flicker of hesitation before he nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. What would you like to know?" They moved to a small alcove off the kitchen, where Hargrove poured them each a cup of strong tea. "Sir Reginald was a brilliant man," he began, his tone reverent, "an inventor, a scholar. He spent hours in his study, tinkering with gadgets and writing his memoirs, but he had his troubles, family disputes mostly." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes encouraging. "Disputes with whom?" Hargrove glanced toward the door, lowering his voice. "Lady Evelyn, for one. They argued often about the estate. Sir Reginald wanted to modernize, bring in new investments, but she preferred tradition. And then there was young Felix, Sir Reginald's nephew. He was like a son to him. But Felix had a wild streak back then, debts from gambling. Sir Reginald bailed him out more than once." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And Dr. Graves, was he the family physician at the time?" Hargrove nodded. "Yes, ma'am. He attended Sir Reginald during his final illness." "No, wait, it was the accident. But before that, Sir Reginald had been unwell, complaining of headaches and dizziness. Dr. Graves prescribed tonics, but he trailed off, his expression clouding." "But," Miss Marple prompted softly. The butler sighed. "Rumours, miss. Some said the tonics were too strong, or perhaps tampered with, but it was ruled an accident. The rifle misfired during a hunt. Sir Reginald was alone in the woods that day." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Alone? No witnesses?" "None," Hargrove confirmed. "Felix found him hours later. It was a terrible shock for everyone." Thanking Hargrove, Miss Marple wandered back to the conservatory, her mind piecing together the fragments. Sir Reginald's symptoms mirrored Felix's recent collapse, dizziness, weakness, and the letters hinted at a betrayal. Could the accident have been staged? The rifle tampered with after a slow poisoning weakened him? Her reflections were interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the adjacent room. Peering through the glass door, she saw Rupert Langley and Clara Wentworth in heated discussion near the library entrance. "You're meddling where you shouldn't," Rupert hissed, his charming facade cracked. "That cigarette case is none of your business." Clara laughed sharply, her notebook clutched like a shield. "Everything's my business, darling. Writers thrive on secrets. And yours? They're practically spilling out." Rupert's face darkened. "Watch yourself, Clara. Some secrets bite back." As he stormed off, Clara caught sight of Miss Marple and approached, her expression shifting to one of calculated nonchalance. "Eavesdropping, Miss Marple? Not very ladylike." "Merely observing," Miss Marple replied, her smile serene. "You and Mr. Langley seem acquainted, more than you've let on, perhaps?" Clara's eyes narrowed, but she shrugged. "We crossed paths in London years ago. Literary circles, you know. Rupert was courting Beatrice then, but he had ambitions." "Ambitions," Miss Marple echoed. "For wealth, status. Beatrice's connection to the Harcourts was his ticket. But Sir Reginald didn't approve, thought Rupert was a fortune hunter. Funny how things turned out after the old man's death." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the revelation. Clara's knowledge suggested she had her own stake in the mystery, perhaps researching for a novel or something more personal. Later, Miss Marple sought out Felix in his room, where he lounged by the window, a book unopened in his lap. "Mr. Harcourt," she said, entering after a polite knock, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Felix straightened, his eyes wary. "Not at all. What can I do for you, Miss Marple?" "I've been learning about your uncle," she said, seating herself. "He sounds like a remarkable man. You were close?" Felix's gaze drifted to the window. "Yes, very. He taught me everything. Chess, history, even a bit of inventing. But we had our differences. I was young, foolish, ran up debts. Uncle Reginald was disappointed." "And the day of the accident?" Miss Marple asked gently. "You found him?" Felix swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "It was awful. Blood everywhere. The rifle beside him. I still dream about it." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did he seem unwell before the hunt? Dizzy, perhaps?" Felix's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "Yes, he'd been complaining for weeks. Dr. Graves said it was nerves, but..." He hesitated, then whispered, "I think someone was poisoning him, slowly, to make it look natural. But the accident happened first." "Who would do such a thing?" Miss Marple pressed. Felix shook his head. "I don't know. Evelyn? She inherited everything. Or maybe Graves. He was always around. But why now, with that cigarette case surfacing?" "Perhaps to stir the past," Miss Marple said, "or to warn of the present." Leaving Felix, Miss Marple encountered Beatrice in the hallway, her face flushed as if from crying. "Mrs. Langley," Miss Marple said, "you look distressed. Is there anything I can do?" Beatrice dabbed at her eyes. "It's Rupert," we argued. "He says I'm being paranoid, but I saw him with Clara last night, whispering in the garden. And now this talk of poison. Miss Marple, what if Rupert was involved in Sir Reginald's death for my inheritance?" Miss Marple patted her arm. "Hush, my dear. Accusations without proof are dangerous. But tell me, did you benefit from Sir Reginald's will?" Beatrice nodded. "A small trust fund, but Rupert managed it, invested it poorly. We're in debt now." Another motive, Miss Marple thought. Rupert's ambitions, Clara's knowledge, Felix's fears, Graves' tonics, Evelyn's control. The shadows from the past were lengthening, intertwining with the present. That evening, as the guests gathered for drinks, the tension was palpable. Lady Evelyn announced a séance, half in jest, to commune with Reginald's spirit, but Miss Marple declined, retiring early to ponder the letters again. One phrase stood out: "The truth lies where the dust settles." Dust, like the etching on the cigarette case, or perhaps something more literal. Slipping downstairs after dark, Miss Marple returned to the study where she'd found the letters. Using her magnifying glass, she examined the desk more closely, noticing a faint layer of dust in the drawers. Brushing it aside, she discovered a hidden compartment, triggered by a small lever. Inside lay a vial, half empty, labeled Tonic, Dr. Graves. Her heart quickened. This could be the poison, or proof of it. As she pocketed the vial, a floorboard creaked behind her. She turned, but the room was empty. Yet the shadows seemed deeper, more menacing, as if the past itself was closing in. Chapter 8. A Midnight Discovery. The clock in the hall struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the silent corridors of Dusthaven Manor like a solemn warning. Miss Jane Marple lay awake in her bed, the vial from the hidden compartment weighing heavily in her thoughts. She had concealed it in her knitting bag, nestled among balls of wool and needles, but its presence was a constant reminder of the dark undercurrents swirling beneath the manor's genteel surface. The séance Lady Evelyn had proposed earlier had proceeded without her, a foolish endeavour in Miss Marple's opinion, more likely to stir emotions than spirits. Yet from the muffled voices that had drifted up the stairs, it seemed to have done just that. Unable to sleep, Miss Marple rose, slipping on her dressing gown and soft slippers. The house was quiet, but she knew from experience that midnight often revealed what daylight concealed. With a small flashlight from her handbag, another practical item she always carried, she ventured into the hallway, her steps cautious and silent. The manor at night was a different creature, its grandeur transformed into something almost foreboding. Shadows danced on the walls from the moonlight filtering through the windows, and the air carried a chill that seeped into her bones. She made her way downstairs, guided by memory and the faint beam of her light, toward the library. The cigarette case with its etched clue still held secrets, she was sure, and perhaps a closer examination under cover of darkness would yield more. As she approached the library door, a faint noise caught her ear, a soft rustling, like papers being shuffled. She paused, extinguishing her flashlight and pressing herself against the wall. The door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling out from within. Peering through the crack, Miss Marple saw a figure hunched over the table where the cigarette case rested in its glass box. The person was gloved, their movements furtive, attempting to pry open the lock with a thin tool. Her heart quickened, but she remained still. Observing, the figure succeeded, lifting the lid and snatching the cigarette case. As they turned toward the light, Miss Marple recognized the face, Dr. Lionel Graves, his twitch absent in this moment of concentration, replaced by a determined grimace. Dr. Graves pocketed the case and moved toward the door. Miss Marple retreated into the shadows of a nearby alcove, her breath held. He passed without noticing her, heading toward the back of the house. She followed at a distance, her slippers muffling her steps, curiosity overriding caution. He led her to the conservatory, where the glass walls reflected the starry sky. Dr. Graves paused, glancing around before kneeling by a large potted fern. He dug into the soil with his hands, unearthing a small metal box. Placing the cigarette case inside, he reburied it, patting the earth smooth. Miss Marple watched from the doorway, her mind racing. Why hide the case, and what else might be in that box? As Dr. Graves stood, brushing dirt from his knees, he froze, sensing her presence. "Who's there?" he called, his voice sharp with alarm. Miss Marple stepped into the light, her expression calm. "Only me, Doctor. I couldn't sleep and thought a stroll might help, but it seems you've been gardening at an unusual hour." Dr. Graves' face paled, his twitch returning with a vengeance. "Miss Marple, I was just, it's not what it looks like." "Oh," she said mildly, her eyes fixed on the disturbed soil. "Then perhaps you can explain why you've taken the cigarette case and buried it like a guilty secret." He sighed, slumping into a wicker chair. "Very well, but you must promise discretion." "This could ruin me." Miss Marple sat opposite him, her hands folded in her lap. "I make no promises, Doctor, but I will listen." Dr. Graves rubbed his temples, his voice low. 15 years ago, Sir Reginald came to me with suspicions. He believed someone was poisoning him, slowly with arsenic or something similar. He showed me symptoms: dizziness, weakness, stomach pains. I tested him discreetly and confirmed it. But before I could confront anyone, the hunting accident happened. Miss Marple leaned forward. "And you suspected foul play?" "Yes," he admitted. "The rifle was tampered with, I'm sure, but there was no proof, and the inquest ruled it accidental." Reginald had etched that clue on his cigarette case as a message, pointing to the study where he hid evidence, the vial of tainted tonic I prescribed, but which someone had altered. "The vial I found," Miss Marple said softly, producing it from her pocket. Dr. Graves's eyes widened. "You found it? Then you know. I buried the case to protect it, in case the poisoner is still here, trying to cover their tracks. Felix's collapse. It was the same symptoms. Someone's at it again." "Who?" Miss Marple pressed. "Who benefits?" Dr. Graves hesitated. "Evelyn inherited the bulk, but Felix got a trust. Rupert. He married Beatrice shortly after, and they've been pressing for more from the estate. Clara's been snooping, writing a book on unsolved mysteries. Any of them could have motive." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving connections. "And you, Doctor? Why stay silent all these years?" Guilt flashed in his eyes. "I was afraid. If word got out that my tonic was used for murder, my reputation. But now, with the case resurfacing, I had to act." Their conversation was cut short by a noise from the house, a distant thud, followed by a cry. They hurried back, finding the other guests assembling in the hall, roused from sleep. Lady Evelyn, in her nightgown, looked frantic. "It's Felix. He's collapsed again in the library." Dr. Graves rushed ahead, Miss Marple following. Felix lay on the floor, convulsing slightly, foam at his lips. The glass box was open, empty. Dr. Graves knelt, checking his pulse. "Poison definite this time. We need an antidote." As chaos ensued, Miss Marple slipped away, retrieving her flashlight. Back in the conservatory, she dug up the metal box. Inside, besides the cigarette case, was a folded paper, a will, Sir Reginald's last, dated days before his death. It revoked Evelyn's inheritance, leaving everything to Felix, with a note in light of betrayal. Her discovery was interrupted by footsteps. Turning, she saw Clara Wentworth, a sly smile on her face. "Well, well, Miss Marple, midnight discoveries suit you." Clara's presence raised alarms. "Miss Wentworth, what brings you here?" "Insomnia," Clara said, eyeing the box, "and curiosity. That's the will, isn't it? The one that changes everything." Miss Marple closed the box. "Perhaps, but curiosity can be dangerous." Clara laughed softly. "So can knowledge. Good night, Miss Marple." As Clara departed, Miss Marple returned to the hall where Felix was being tended to. He would survive, Dr. Graves assured, but the attack confirmed a poisoner among them. The shadows of the past had merged with the present, and Miss Marple knew the midnight discovery was but a prelude to greater revelations. Chapter 9. False Alibis and Hidden Motives. The dawn light filtered through the curtains of Dusthaven Manor, casting a pale glow over the chaos of the previous night. Felix Harcourt had been stabilized by Dr. Graves's quick administration of an antidote, but the young man remained weak, confined to his bed under strict orders to rest. The atmosphere in the house was electric with suspicion, each guest eyeing the others as potential culprits. Miss Jane Marple, having secured the metal box with Sir Reginald's will and the cigarette case in her room, knew that the time had come to probe deeper into the alibis and motives that swirled around the poisoning attempts. She began her day with a quiet breakfast in the dining room, where Lady Evelyn joined her, her face etched with worry lines that seemed deeper in the morning light. Miss Marple, Lady Evelyn said, stirring her tea absently. Last night's events were terrifying. Felix nearly died. Do you think it's connected to my brother's death? Miss Marple set down her toast, her eyes meeting Lady Evelyn's with steady compassion. I believe so, Lady Evelyn. The symptoms are too similar to ignore. But to uncover the truth, we must examine where everyone was during the critical moments, both for Felix's first collapse and this latest one. Lady Evelyn nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. Very well. I'll gather the others after breakfast. We must get to the bottom of this. The group assembled in the drawing room an hour later, the air thick with tension. Dr. Graves paced by the window, his twitch more pronounced than ever. Clara Wentworth sat with her notebook open, ready to record every detail. Rupert Langley leaned against the mantel, his charm subdued, while Beatrice fidgeted beside him, her eyes red-rimmed. Felix, too frail to join, was represented by his empty chair. Miss Marple stood before them, her posture unassuming, but her presence commanding. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice calm. "2 attempts have been made on Mr. Felix's life, mirroring the ailments that plagued Sir Reginald before his accident. To find the perpetrator, we must establish alibis for the times in question. Let's start with the first incident. After luncheon, 2 days ago, where were each of you?" Dr. Graves spoke first, his voice gruff. "I was in the garden, taking a walk to ease my rheumatism. Alone, I'm afraid, no one to vouch for me." Miss Marple nodded, making a mental note. "And you, Miss Wentworth?" Clara smiled faintly. "In the library, researching for my next book. I saw no one, but I heard footsteps in the hall. Could have been anyone." Rupert cleared his throat. "Beatrice and I were in our room discussing private matters. We were together the whole time." Beatrice nodded quickly, but Miss Marple caught the brief hesitation in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. "Private matters." Miss Marple repeated mildly, "Of course." Lady Evelyn straightened. "I was in my study, going over estate accounts. The butler can confirm he brought me tea around that time." Miss Marple turned to the group. "Now, for last night. Felix collapsed in the library around midnight. Where were you all?" The room shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Graves stopped pacing. "I was in my room, reading, but I stepped out briefly to the conservatory. Insomnia, you see?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. She knew exactly what he had been doing there, burying the cigarette case, but she held her tongue for now. Clara leaned forward. "I was writing in my room, heard the cry and came down." Rupert's smile was tight. "Beatrice and I were asleep. We woke to the commotion." Beatrice murmured agreement, but her fingers twisted her handkerchief into knots, betraying her nerves. Lady Evelyn's voice was steady. "I was in bed, but I rose when I heard the noise." Miss Marple paused, letting the silence stretch. "Interesting, but alibis, like knitted patterns, can have dropped stitches. For instance, Mrs. Langley. You told me earlier that you overheard your husband in the garden yesterday afternoon, speaking of concerns if the old woman figures it out. That suggests motive, does it not?" Beatrice gasped, her face paling, while Rupert's expression hardened. "Beatrice!" "You misunderstood. I was talking about a case in London, nothing to do with this." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Perhaps. But motives are emerging. Mr. Langley, your marriage to Beatrice coincided with her inheritance from Sir Reginald, a small trust now depleted by poor investments. Desperation can drive one to extremes. Rupert's charm evaporated. That's slanderous, Miss Marple. I love my wife, and what of others? Clara's been prying into family secrets for her book. Perhaps she stirred up trouble. Clara laughed sharply. My book? It's fiction, darling. But yes, I've uncovered things, like how Dr. Graves' tonic was used in Sir Reginald's poisoning. Hidden motives there, Doctor. Dr. Graves flushed. I explained to Miss Marple. I suspected tampering, but stayed silent to protect my reputation. But I didn't do it. Lady Evelyn intervened. Her voice sharp. Enough accusations. Miss Marple, what have you found? Miss Marple reached into her handbag, producing the vial and the will from the metal box. This vial, labelled as your tonic, Doctor, was hidden in Sir Reginald's study. And this will, his final one, disinherits you, Lady Evelyn, leaving everything to Felix. Motive for murder, perhaps. The room erupted. Lady Evelyn stood, her face ashen. That's impossible. Reginald never changed his will. I would have known. Felix, who had managed to join them quietly, leaning on the doorframe, spoke weakly. Aunt Evelyn, is it true? Lady Evelyn whirled on him. You ungrateful boy. After all I've done, managing the estate while you squandered your trust on vices. Miss Marple raised a hand for silence. Alibis falter under scrutiny. For example, Dr. Graves, you claim insomnia last night, but I saw you bury the cigarette case in the conservatory. To protect it, you said. Yet, why not reveal it sooner? Dr. Graves stammered. I was scared. If the poisoner knew I had evidence. And Mrs. Langley, Miss Marple continued, you say you were with your husband during the first collapse, but earlier you mentioned seeing Clara near Felix's room the night before. Inconsistencies breed doubt. Beatrice burst into tears. I lied. Rupert wasn't with me, he slipped out. I don't know where. Rupert glared at her. Beatrice, shut up. You're making it worse. Clara smirked. Hidden motives indeed. Rupert and I, we knew each other before. He approached me to dig up dirt on the Harcourts, to pressure for more money. But I refused. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Blackmail, another motive. As the arguments escalated, Miss Marple slipped out, heading to the garden for fresh air. There, she found Hargrove, the butler, tending to the roses. Mr. Hargrove, she said, you've been with the family long. Did Sir Reginald confide in you about the betrayal? Hargrove straightened, his eyes weary. He did. Miss suspected his sister, Lady Evelyn, of tampering with his tonics. She wanted control of the estate, feared his modern ideas would ruin it, but proof was lacking. Miss Marple nodded. And the will? Did he mention changing it? I gave it to me to hide, but I buried it with the case, fearing for my job. Back in the drawing room, the group had calmed, but suspicions lingered. Miss Marple re-entered, addressing Lady Evelyn. Your alibi for the first collapse, the butler bringing tea. But Hargrove says he was in the kitchen all afternoon. False alibi, Lady Evelyn. Lady Evelyn's composure cracked. I must have misremembered. Miss Marple sighed. Hidden motives, greed, fear, revenge. But the truth is emerging, thread by thread. As the day wore on, Miss Marple pieced more together, uncovering a false receipt in Rupert's room for arsenic purchased under a pseudonym, and Clara's notes revealing her own grudge against Sir Reginald for rejecting her manuscript years ago. Alibis crumbled, motives exposed, but the full picture remained elusive, hinting at a conspiracy deeper than any single person. Chapter 10. The Garden's Secret. The late afternoon sun bathed the gardens of Dusthaven Manor in a soft golden light, but the beauty of the roses and manicured hedges did little to ease the mounting tension within the house. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped snugly around her shoulders, strolled along the gravel paths, her mind sifting through the tangled threads of alibis, motives and revelations from the morning's confrontations, the false receipt for arsenic in Rupert's room, Clara's hidden grudge, Lady Evelyn's crumbling alibi, and Hargrove's confession about Sir Reginald's suspicions, painted a picture of a conspiracy rooted deep in the manor's past. Yet one piece of the puzzle remained elusive, a piece Miss Marple suspected lay hidden in the garden itself. She paused by the stone fountain, its gentle trickle a soothing contrast to the storm of secrets brewing inside. The fountain, she noted, stood at the exact spot marked by the X on the cigarette case's etched map. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. Kneeling carefully, mindful of her joints, she examined the base of the fountain, her fingers brushing over the mossy stone. The surface was weathered, but intact, save for a small, almost imperceptible seam where the base met the ground. Pressing gently, she felt a click, and a slab shifted, revealing a hollow compartment beneath. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but preserved. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she lifted it, glancing around to ensure she was alone. The garden was quiet, the other guests occupied indoors, but she knew privacy was fleeting, in a house where eyes seemed to lurk behind every curtain. Tucking the journal into her handbag, she replaced the slab and rose, her mind already anticipating the secrets the pages might hold. Back in her room, Miss Marple locked the door and settled at the small writing desk. The journal bore Sir Reginald's initials, R.H., embossed on the cover. Opening it, she found entries dated in the months leading up to his death. The handwriting was steady at first, detailing estate plans and inventions, but grew shakier as the entries progressed, reflecting his deteriorating health. One passage caught her eye. March 12, 1914. I am certain now. Someone is tampering with my tonics. The dizziness worsens daily, and my suspicions point to Evelyn. She covets the estate, fears my plans to modernize will ruin her legacy. But I lack proof. I have hidden the vial and drafted a new will, leaving all to Felix, my true heir. If I fall, let this journal guide him to the truth. Another entry, dated a week later, was more urgent. March 19th, 1914. Clara Wentworth visited today demanding I fund her novel. When I refused, she threatened to expose family secrets, things she learned from Felix's reckless talk. I fear she knows too much. The rifle is prepared for tomorrow's hunt, but I sense a shadow over me. The truth lies in the garden, where dust settles undisturbed. Miss Marple closed the journal, her thoughts racing. The garden, the fountain, the X. Sir Reginald had left a trail, knowing his life was in danger, but who had acted? Evelyn, driven by greed? Clara, seeking revenge? Or Rupert, whose arsenic receipt suggested darker ambitions? Her musings were interrupted by a sharp knock. Opening the door, she found Clara Wentworth, her eyes alight with curiosity. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice low. "I saw you in the garden. Digging, were you? Found something interesting?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hand resting on the desk to conceal the journal. "Merely admiring the roses, Miss Wentworth. though you seem to have a knack for spotting things others miss. Clara Sitt's smile was sharp. A writer Sitt's gift. I bet you Sitt's no mere tourist, are you? You Sitt's unraveling this mystery, piece by piece. Care to share? Not yet, Miss Marple said. But tell me, how well did you know Sir Reginald? You mentioned a grudge earlier. Clara Stice's expression hardened. He was a pompous fool. All thought, my writing beneath him. I stide have made my fortune, if he stide backed me. But I didn't stide kill him, if that stide's what you stide's thinking. Yet you knew of his secrets. Miss Marple pressed, from Felix perhaps. Clara hesitated, then shrugged. Felix was a chatterbox in his youth, spilled plenty about the family, Evelyn Sitt's ambitions, Reginald Sitt's plans, but I cert, no poisoner. Miss Marple nodded, letting the matter drop. After Clara left, she ventured downstairs, seeking Rupert.
She found him in the billiard room,
Idly rolling a cue ball across the table. Mr. Langley, she said, a word about that receipt I found in your room, arsenic, purchased under a false name. Care to explain? Rupert Stice's hand froze, his charm replaced by a cold stare. You Stet's been snooping, Miss Marple. That receipt was for a client Stice's case, a fraud investigation. Nothing to do with this house. Yet it Sitt's curious timing, she said, her tone mild, and your wife mentioned your financial troubles. Desperation can lead to desperate acts. Rupert slammed the cue ball into a pocket. I stum no murderer. If you want a culprit, look at Evelyn. She had everything to lose if Reginald Sitt's new will surfaced. Their conversation was cut short by a cry from the hall. Rushing out, Miss Marple found Beatrice, trembling, pointing to a shattered vase in the corridor. It fell, she whispered. I was walking by, and it just fell. Someone pushed it. Miss Marple examined the scene. The vase had stood on a high shelf too stable to fall on its own. A warning, perhaps, or an attempt to intimidate. She glanced at Beatrice. Did you see anyone? Beatrice shook her head, tears welling. No, but I stum scared. First Felix, now this. What Sitt's happening? Someone is feeling cornered, Miss Marple said softly, but we shall find them. That evening, as the guests gathered for dinner, the air was thick with unease. Felix, still pale but determined, joined them, his eyes darting nervously. Lady Evelyn attempted to steer the conversation to neutral topics, but the effort fell flat. Graves, unusually quiet, avoided Miss Marple's gaze, while Clara scribbled notes, her pen a constant scratch against the tension. After dinner, Miss Marple cornered Dr. Graves in the library. Doctor, she said, you admitted to finding arsenic in Sir Reginald Sitt's system. Did you ever test the vial I found? He nodded, his twitch betraying his nerves. Yes, it contained arsenic, diluted, but enough to cause symptoms over time. I swear, I didn't tamper with it. Then who did? Miss Marple asked. And why target Felix now? Dr. Graves hesitated. Evelyn, she was furious when Reginald planned to change the will. And Rupert, he said's been pressing Felix for loans, using Beatrice Sest's trust as leverage. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the journal, the will, the vial. The garden's secret had confirmed Sir Reginald's murder, but the second attempt on Felix suggested the killer was still active, desperate to protect their secret. As she retired to her room, she locked the door, aware that the next move in this deadly game could be aimed at her. The truth was close, but danger closer still. Chapter 11. rising tensions, and a second shock. The morning after the discovery of Sir Reginald's journal brought a restless energy to Dusthaven Manor, as if the very walls were bracing for the next blow. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room, the journal open on the desk before her, its pages a testament to a man who had sensed his doom approaching. The shattered vase in the corridor, Beatrice's trembling fear, and the arsenic-laced vial all pointed to a killer growing desperate, their carefully laid plans unravelling under scrutiny. Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched in her lap, her mind too occupied with the threads of motive and opportunity that were beginning to form a coherent pattern. She descended to the breakfast room, where the guests were already gathered, their faces drawn and their voices hushed. Felix, though still weak, sat at the table, his hands clutching a cup of tea as if it were an anchor. Lady Evelyn's poise was strained, her eyes darting to each guest with a mixture of suspicion and defiance. Rupert Langley maintained his polished demeanor, but his smile was brittle, while Beatrice sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the tablecloth. Clara Wentworth scribbled in her notebook, her pen a restless companion, and Dr. Graves, his twitch more pronounced, muttered about the need for calm. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, taking her seat with a serene nod. "I trust you all managed some rest after last night. Sit's disturbances." "Rest?" Clara snapped, her voice sharp. "With someone pushing vases and poisoning people? Hardly." Lady Evelyn Sett's cup clinked against its saucer. "Miss Wentworth, please. We sit all on edge, but accusations one Set's help." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said mildly, spreading marmalade on her toast, "clarity is what we need. The vase its fall was no accident, just as Felix Sitt's collapses were not. Someone is trying to silence the past, or those who uncover it." Felix Sitt's hands trembled, spilling tea. "You think I'm still in danger?" "Why me?" Miss Marple Sitt's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "Because, Mr. Harcourt, you are the key to Sir Reginald Sitt's intentions. His final will, hidden in the garden, names you his heir. Someone in this room stands to lose greatly, if that will is honoured." The silence was deafening, broken only by Rupert Sitt's forced laugh. "Come now, Miss Marple. You sit spinning tales. That will is old news, if it sits even real. Let Sit's not turn breakfast into a courtroom." "Yet evidence mounts," Miss Marple countered. "A vial of arsenic, a tampered rifle, a journal detailing betrayal, and now attempts to frighten us into silence. Who here has the most to hide?" Dr. Graves cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "I told you. I only prescribed the tonic. Someone else tampered with it. I no killer." Clara leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "But you hid the truth, Doctor. That Sit's nearly as bad. And what about you, Lady Evelyn? You inherited everything when Reginald died. Convenient, wasn't it?" Lady Evelyn Sett's face flushed, her composure cracking. "How dare you? I loved my brother. I kept this estate alive, despite Felix Sett's recklessness and your incessant prying." Beatrice Steck's voice, barely audible, cut through the tension. What if it's Steck's all connected? The will, the poison, the vase? Someone wants us all scared, or worse. Rupert gripped her hand, his tone sharp. "Beatrice, stop. You stir, letting this old woman Sid's theories get to you." Miss Marple, Sid's eyes narrowed slightly at old woman, but she let it pass, noting Rupert Sid's defensiveness. She decided to push further. "Mr. Langley, your receipt for arsenic is troubling. And Mrs. Langley, you admitted Rupert left your side during Felix Sid's first collapse. Where was he? Beatrice shrank under Rupert Sid's glare, but she whispered, he said he was in the library, but I didn't see him there. Rupert stood, his chair scraping. This is absurd. I was in the library, looking for a book. Ask Clara. She was there. Clara Sid's pen paused. I didn't see you, Rupert. I was alone until I heard Felix collapse. The room erupted in accusations, voices overlapping until Lady Evelyn slammed her hand on the table. Enough, Miss Marple. If you have proof, present it. Otherwise, stop stirring trouble. Miss Marple folded her napkin, unruffled. Proof requires patience, Lady Evelyn, but I assure you the truth is near. After breakfast, Miss Marple sought solitude in the conservatory, where she reviewed the journal's final entries. One mentioned a locked room in the manor's west wing, a place Sir Reginald used for his experiments. Intrigued, she made her way to the west wing, a neglected part of the house with dusty corridors and locked doors. Using her hairpin, she opened a heavy oak door marked with a faded brass plate. Inside, the room was a relic of Sir Reginald's brilliance: glass beakers, rusted tools and shelves of chemicals, all coated in dust. A small safe stood in the corner, its lock rusted but intact. Miss Marple examined it, suspecting it held more of Reginald's secrets. Before she could attempt to open it, a shadow fell across the doorway. Miss Marple, came Rupert Sid's voice, low and dangerous. You sit persistent, sit you. She turned, her expression calm. Merely curious, Mr. Langley. This room seems to hold answers. Care to help me find them? Rupert stepped closer, his charm gone. You set to digging too deep. Some things are better left buried. Before she could respond, a scream echoed through the house. Rupert cursed and ran toward the sound, Miss Marple following at a brisk pace. They found the guests in the hall, gathered around Clara, who lay crumpled at the foot of the stairs, her notebook scattered beside her. Graves knelt, checking her pulse. She's set's alive, he said, relief evident. Fell down the stairs or was pushed. Clara groaned, stirring. Someone behind me. Felt a hand. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the group. Beatrice was trembling. Felix pale. Lady Evelyn. Rupert's face was unreadable, but his hands were clenched. The second shock had struck, and the killer's desperation was growing. Miss Marple knelt beside Clara, retrieving the notebook. A single word was scrawled on the open page. Safe. Back in her room, Miss Marple locked the door. Her mind racing, the laboratory safe, the journal, the will, all pointed to a truth someone was willing to kill to protect. Clara's fall was no accident, and the word safe suggested she had been close to uncovering something vital. As night fell, Miss Marple resolved to open the safe, but she knew the killer was watching, their moves bolder with each passing hour. The tension was rising, and the next shock might be the last. Chapter 12. Piecing the Puzzle. The air in Dusthaven Manor seemed to thicken with each passing hour, as if the weight of its secrets pressed down on the very stones. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room, the laboratory safe's existence burning in her thoughts like a beacon. Clara's fall down the stairs, the scrawled words safe in her notebook, and the mounting evidence of a killer's desperation pointed to a final piece of Sir Reginald's puzzle hidden within that locked box. Miss Marple's knitting lay neglected, her hands instead flipping through the journal, rereading passages that hinted at betrayal and a truth buried in the manor's heart. The time for subtlety was waning. She needed to act before the killer struck again. After a light luncheon, where the guests ate in near silence, their eyes darting with suspicion, Miss Marple slipped away to the west wing. The laboratory door was still unlocked, and she entered cautiously, her flashlight casting a narrow beam across the dusty shelves. The safe stood in the corner, its rusted surface unyielding. She knelt, examining the lock, a combination type, old but sturdy. Sir Reginald, she recalled from his journal, was fond of codes. She tried a sequence based on his initials and the date of his death, March 12, 14. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. Inside was a single item, a sealed envelope, marked to be opened by Felix Harcourt. Miss Marple hesitated, then broke the seal, reasoning that Felix's safety depended on her speed. The letter inside was brief but devastating. My dear Felix, if you read this, I am gone, likely by foul means. Evelyn has poisoned my tonics, driven by her fear of losing the estate. Dr. Graves knows, but fears for his reputation. Clara Wentworth seeks to exploit our secrets. Trust no one but yourself. The proof is in the garden fountain, where I hid my journal. Forgive me for the burden this places on you. Your Uncle Reginald. Miss Marple's breath caught. The letter confirmed her suspicions, but raised new questions. If Evelyn was the poisoner, why target Felix now, years later? And what role did Clara's fall play? She tucked the letter into her handbag, beside the journal, and locked the safe, her mind racing to connect the final threads. As she emerged from the laboratory, she nearly collided with Hargrove, the butler, his face pale. Miss Marple, he whispered, something sets wrong. Miss Wentworth, she sits missing. Missing? Miss Marple Sitzer's eyes sharpened. Since when? She wasn't stite at luncheon, and her room sips empty. I checked the library, the garden nothing. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Clara, with her relentless curiosity, had been close to the truth. Had the killer silenced her permanently? Gather the others in the drawing room, she instructed. We must act quickly. Within the hour, the guests assembled, their faces a mix of fear and defiance.
Hey!
Felix, still frail, leaned on Dr. Graves, who looked ashen. Rupert and Beatrice sat close, their hands clasped, while Lady Evelyn stood by the fireplace, her posture rigid. Hargrove hovered at the door, his eyes scanning the room. Miss Wentworth is missing, Miss Marple announced, her voice calm but commanding. And I believe it's connected to the secrets we've uncovered. Sir Reginald's death was no accident. He was poisoned, slowly with arsenic, and his rifle tampered with to ensure his silence. His final will, naming Felix as heir, threatens someone in this room. And now, Clara, who was close to exposing the truth, is gone. Lady Evelyn Sep's face darkened. This is preposterous. I loved my brother. I would never. Yet his journal names you, Miss Marple interjected, holding up the leather-bound book, and this letter, found in the laboratory safe, confirms it. You poisoned his tonics, fearing his plans to modernize the estate. Felix gasped, his eyes wide. Aunt Evelyn, is it true? Lady Evelyn Sep's composure cracked, her voice trembling. I only wanted to protect our legacy. Reginald was reckless, squandering our wealth on inventions. But murder, never. Dr. Graves stepped forward, his twitch gone. Then explain the vial. Evelyn, I tested it. Arsenic. just as in Reginald Sit's system, and Felix Sit's collapses match perfectly. Rupert snorted. Convenient, Doctor, to point fingers. You hid the truth for years to save your own skin. Beatrice Sett's voice broke through, trembling. And you, Rupert, that arsenic receipt. I found it in your things. Were you part of this? Rupert Sitt's charm vanished. I bought it for a client, Beatrice. Stop twisting everything. Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing the room. Enough. Clara's disappearance suggests the killer is still active. We must search the manor, every room, every corner. The search began, tense and methodical. Miss Marple led the group to the attic, suspecting Clara's curiosity had drawn her there. They found her, unconscious but alive, slumped against a trunk, a gash on her forehead. Her notebook lay open, a new entry scrawled, Evelyn and Rupert, partners in crime. Dr. Graves revived Clara, who groaned, clutching her head. I heard them talking, she whispered, in the attic about the will. Someone hit me from behind. Miss Marple Sit's eyes narrowed. Them? Who, Clara? Evelyn and Rupert, Clara said, her voice faint. They knew I was listening. The group turned to Lady Evelyn and Rupert, who stood frozen. Evelyn Sett's face was a mask of fury, while Rupert Sett's eyes darted, seeking an escape. This is nonsense, he snapped. Clara Sett's delusional. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice steady. Not delusional. The letter, the vial, all point to a conspiracy. Evelyn, you poisoned Reginald to secure the estate. Rupert, you learned of the new will through Beatrice and saw a chance to manipulate Felix's trust fund. When the cigarette case surfaced, you both panicked, targeting Felix to prevent the will's discovery. Beatrice sobbed. Rupert, how could you? Before Rupert could respond, a crash echoed from the hall. Hargrove rushed in, breathless. The library, its studs on fire. The group ran, finding flames licking at the library's bookshelves. The glass box shattered. The cigarette case was gone. Miss Marple's mind raced. The fire was a distraction, a final act to destroy evidence. But the puzzle was nearly complete. Evelyn and Rupert's alibis had crumbled. Clara's survival exposed their desperation, and the truth was within reach. As the flames roared, Miss Marple knew the final confrontation loomed, and she would need all her wits to end this deadly game. Chapter 13. The Confrontation in the Drawing Room. The acrid smell of smoke lingered in the air as the fire in the library was extinguished, thanks to the swift efforts of Hargrove and the manor's staff. The damage was contained, but the cigarette case was gone, likely taken by the perpetrator in a desperate bid to erase the final piece of evidence. Miss Jane Marple stood in the hall, her lavender cardigan slightly askew, her sharp eyes scanning the faces of the guests who had gathered, their expressions a mix of fear, anger, and exhaustion. The fire had been no accident, just as Clara's fall, Felix's poisonings, and Sir Reginald's death were not. The threads of the mystery were converging, and Miss Marple knew the time had come to force the truth into the open. She requested everyone assemble in the drawing room, her voice calm but carrying an authority that brooked no refusal. The room, with its heavy drapes and flickering chandelier, felt like a stage set for the final act. Lady Evelyn stood by the fireplace, her face pale but defiant. Rupert Langley leaned against a chair, his charm replaced by a tense wariness. Beatrice sat on a sofa, clutching a handkerchief, her eyes red from crying. Felix, still weak but resolute, perched beside her, his gaze flickering between his aunt and the others. Doctor, Graves hovered near the door, his twitch betraying his nerves, while Clara Wentworth, her forehead bandaged, clutched her notebook with a grim determination. Hargrove remained at the edge of the room, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Miss Marple stood before them, her hands clasped, her demeanor serene yet unyielding. "We have reached a critical moment," she began, her voice steady. "Sir Reginald Harcourt was murdered 15 years ago, poisoned with arsenic and killed by a tampered rifle to mask the crime. His journal, hidden in the garden fountain, and his final letter, found in the laboratory safe, point to a conspiracy driven by greed and betrayal. 2 attempts on Felix's life and an attack on Miss Wentworth show that the killer or killers are among us, desperate to keep their secret buried. Make it dumber." Lady Evelyn Sitt's eyes flashed. "This is outrageous, Miss Marple. You spun a tale from old papers and wild imagination. I demand proof." "Proof," Miss Marple said, reaching into her handbag, "is here." She produced the journal, the letter, and the vial, placing them on the table. "Sir Reginald's own words name you, Lady Evelyn, as the one who tampered with his tonics. You feared his plans to modernize the estate would ruin your legacy. His new will, leaving everything to Felix, threatened your control." Felix gasped, his voice breaking. "Aunt Evelyn, you killed him." Lady Evelyn Sitt's composure wavered, but she held her ground. "Nonsense. I loved my brother. Those writings are forgeries, or the ravings of a sick man." Miss Marple turned to Rupert. "And you, Mr. Langley, married Beatrice for her connection to the Harcourt fortune. When you learned of the new will through her, you saw an opportunity. The arsenic receipt in your room, purchased under a false name, suggests you planned to eliminate Felix, ensuring Beatrice's trust fund and your debts remained secure." Rupert Stett's face darkened, his fists clenching. "You Stett grasping at straws, old woman. That receipt was for a client Stett's case. Beatrice, tell her." Beatrice shook her head, tears streaming. "I don't know any more. Rupert, you lied about being in the library, and I heard you plotting with someone. Was it her?" She pointed at Lady Evelyn. Clara interjected, her voice sharp. "They were plotting, Miss Marple. I overheard them in the attic, talking about the will, how it would ruin everything. That's why I was pushed down the stairs." Lady Evelyn laughed, a brittle sound. "Clara, your imagination is as wild as your novels. You've been sniffing for scandal since you arrived." Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing the room. "Miss Wentworth's notes and survival are inconvenient for you, Lady Evelyn, as is the fire in the library, a clumsy attempt to destroy the cigarette case. But let us consider Dr. Graves." She turned to the physician, who flinched. "You knew of the arsenic in Sir Reginald's system, but stayed silent to protect your reputation. Did you also know of Evelyn and Rupert's plans?" Dr. Graves stammered, his twitch frantic. "I suspected. Yes, but I had no part in it. I buried the cigarette case to keep it safe, not to hide it." Miss Marple nodded, then addressed the group. "The puzzle is nearly complete. Sir Reginald's death was a joint effort. Lady Evelyn poisoned him slowly, weakening him for the hunt where the tampered rifle, arranged by Rupert, who had access through Beatrice, ensured his death. The new will was hidden, but its discovery now threatens you both. Felix's poisonings were to eliminate the heir, and Clara's attack was to silence her knowledge." Rupert lunged forward, his voice a snarl. "You have no proof. This is all conjecture." Miss Marple Sitt's eyes gleamed. "Not quite. Hargrove, please fetch the cigarette case." The butler hesitated, then nodded, retrieving the case from a hidden pocket in his coat. "I found it in the library, miss. Before the fire spread, I kept it safe." The room gasped as Miss Marple held up the case, its etched map glinting in the light. "This points to the fountain where the journal was hidden, but it also bears traces of arsenic, tested by Dr. Graves himself, I presume, when he buried it. Only someone with access to the poison would leave such traces." Lady Evelyn Sitt's face crumpled, and she sank into a chair. "It was for the estate," she whispered. "Reginald was ruining us. I only meant to slow him, not kill him." Rupert Stext's eyes darted to the door, but Hargrove blocked it. "And you, Mr. Langley?" Miss Marple pressed. "The rifle." Rupert Sitt's shoulders slumped. "Evelyn promised me a share. If I helped, Beatrice Sitt's trust wasn't Sitt's enough. We tampered with the rifle, but it was her idea." Beatrice sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Felix stared at his aunt, betrayal in his eyes. Clara scribbled furiously, while Dr. Graves shook his head, muttering about his ruined career. Miss Marple sighed, her voice gentle but firm. "The truth has surfaced, as it always does. Lady Evelyn, Mr. Langley, your actions have caused enough pain. It starts time to face the consequences." As Hargrove summoned the authorities, the room fell silent, the weight of justice settling over Dusthaven Manor. Miss Marple gathered her evidence, knowing the final twist awaited, but for now the confrontation had laid bare the hearts of the guilty. Chapter 14. The Twist Etched in Dust. The drawing-room of Dusthaven Manor was steeped in a heavy silence, broken only by the distant wail of approaching police sirens. The confrontation had stripped away the masks of Lady Evelyn and Rupert Langley, their confessions laying bare a 15-year-old murder born of greed and ambition. Yet Miss Jane Marple, standing quietly by the fireplace, felt a nagging unease. Puzzle was nearly complete, but one final piece remained out of place, a twist she had sensed but not yet grasped. The cigarette case, now resting on the table, glinted in the chandelier's light, its etched map a silent witness to the truth. She knew the resolution hinged on uncovering the last secret hidden in the dust of the past. As the guests waited for the authorities, their faces a mix of shock and relief, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to Clara Wentworth, who sat clutching her notebook, her bandaged forehead a stark reminder of her brush with danger. Clara's role as observer had been pivotal, her notes capturing whispers of conspiracy, yet her survival seemed almost too convenient. Miss Marple's mind returned to the attic, where Clara claimed to have overheard Evelyn and Rupert plotting. Something about her story, the precision of her accusations, the word safe scrawled in her notebook, felt rehearsed like a scene from one of her novels. "Miss Wentworth," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but piercing, "you have been remarkably perceptive throughout this affair. Your notes led us to the laboratory safe, and your survival ensured the truth came to light. Yet I wonder, how did you know to look in the attic?" Clara Sitt's pen paused, her smile faltering. "A hunch, Miss Marple. Writers follow their instincts. I heard voices and investigated." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, stepping closer. "But the attic is remote, its entrance hidden behind a tapestry. Only someone familiar with the manor set secrets would think to go there, and your notebook safe was written before your fall, not after. Almost as if you knew what you set find." The room stilled, all eyes turning to Clara. Felix frowned, his voice weak. "What are you saying, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple produced the cigarette case, holding it up. This case, etched with a map, was meant to guide us to the truth. But it was you, Miss Wentworth, who first suggested it was a map steering us toward the fountain and the study. Your attack in the attic ensured sympathy, diverting suspicion. I believe you've been playing a deeper game. Clara laughed, a brittle sound. You sit spinning fiction now. Miss Marple, I sit am a victim, not a villain. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her eyes unwavering. But let us revisit Sir Reginald's journal. He wrote of your visit, your demand for funds, and your threat to expose family secrets learned from Felix's reckless talk. You knew of the new will before it surfaced, didn't you? And you orchestrated this gathering to force the truth into the open, not for justice but for revenge. Lady Evelyn gasped, her voice sharp. Revenge! Clara, what is she talking about? Miss Marple continued, undeterred. 15 years ago, Sir Reginald rejected your manuscript, denying you fame and fortune. You held a grudge, but you also learned of Evelyn's plan to poison him. You didn't act then, lacking proof, but when the cigarette case surfaced, you saw your chance. You pressured Lady Evelyn to invite me, knowing my reputation, and planted clues to expose her and Rupert, while ensuring Felix's poisonings would cast suspicion on them. Clara Stett's face paled, her notebook slipping to the floor. That Stett's absurd. I was attacked. Or you staged it. Miss Marple said, the gash on your forehead is shallow, self-inflicted perhaps. And the fire in the library started after you slipped away, claiming to rest. You took the cigarette case to fuel the chaos, ensuring Evelyn and Rupert Sitt's guilt would be undeniable. Dr. Graves, his twitch absent for once, spoke up, but the poison Clara had no access to Felix Sitt's food or drink. True, Miss Marple admitted. Evelyn and Rupert handled that, as they confessed. But Clara, you manipulated them, whispering about the will, stoking their fear. You knew Felix's trust fund was depleted, pushing Rupert to act, and you ensured I'd find the journal by pointing me to the fountain. Felix Sett's eyes widened. Clara, you used me. Clara stood, her voice rising. You search all fools. Yes, I knew about the will. Felix blabbed everything in his drunken youth. I wanted Evelyn and Rupert exposed, but I didn't poison anyone. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice was firm. You didn't need to. You set the stage, knowing their greed would do the rest. The attic attack, the fire, these were your flourishes, like a novelist crafting a climax. But you underestimated the dust, Miss Wentworth. It clings to everything, revealing the truth. Hargrove stepped forward, holding a singed cloth. Found this in the library. Miss, smells of kerosene, and it's got Miss Wentworth Sitt's monogram. Clara Setta's defiance crumbled, her shoulders sagging. Fine, I wanted them to pay Evelyn for murdering Reginald, Rupert for his greed. I found the cigarette case years ago, kept it until the right moment. I told Evelyn it had surfaced, forcing her to act. But I didn't hurt Felix. Miss Marple nodded. I believe you. Your crime was manipulation, not murder. But the law will decide your fate. As the police arrived, led by a stern inspector, they took Lady Evelyn and Rupert into custody for Sir Reginald's murder and the attempts on Felix. Clara was detained for arson and conspiracy, her notebook seized as evidence. Beatrice, trembling, clung to Felix, who promised to honour his uncle's wishes and restore the estate. Dr. Graves, shaken but relieved, vowed to testify truthfully, his silence finally broken. Miss Marple watched the scene unfold, the cigarette case in her hand. The dust had settled, revealing not just the killers, but the puppet master who had pulled their strings. The twist, Clara's hidden role, had been the final piece etched in the shadows of Dusthaven's past. Chapter 15. Resolution and Reflections. The morning sun rose over Dusthaven Manor, casting a serene glow across the gardens where secrets had been unearthed and truths laid bare. The police had departed with Lady Evelyn, Rupert Langley, and Clara Wentworth in custody, their confessions and Miss Jane Marple's relentless pursuit of the truth, ensuring justice for Sir Reginald's murder and the attacks on Felix. The manor, though still grand, felt lighter, as if the weight of 15 years of deceit had been lifted from its stones. Miss Marple sat in the conservatory, her knitting resumed at last, the rhythmic click of her needles a quiet counterpoint to the storm that had passed. Felix Harcourt, pale but resolute, joined her, his eyes carrying a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a wicker chair, "I don't know how to thank you. You've saved my life and honored my uncle's memory. But, Aunt Evelyn, Rupert, even Clara, I never imagined such betrayal." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze soft but piercing. "Human nature, Mr. Harcourt, is a complex tapestry. Greed, fear, and revenge wove this tragedy. But your uncle's love for you ensured the truth would surface. His clues, the cigarette case, the journal, the will were his final gift to you." Felix nodded, his voice thick. "I set all honor his wishes. The estate will be restored, not for wealth, but for his vision, progress, community. Beatrice has agreed to help. She sets stronger than I realized." "Mrs. Langley has her own courage," Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. "Loss and betrayal temper the heart, if one lets them." Beatrice entered, her face still shadowed, but her posture steadier. "Miss Marple, I owe you an apology. I doubted you, feared you were stirring trouble, but you sep given us a chance to start anew." Miss Marple inclined her head. "No apology needed, my dear. Doubt is natural when secrets cloud the air. You and Felix will rebuild, and Dusthaven will breathe again." Dr. Graves appeared at the door, his twitch subdued, his expression weary but relieved. "Miss Marple, I sep spoken to the inspector. My silence about Reginald Sit's poisoning, it was cowardice. I set'll testify fully, whatever the cost to my reputation." "A truthful heart is worth more than a spotless name," Miss Marple said gently. "You sep done right by coming forward now." As the trio spoke, Hargrove, the butler, brought tea, his loyalty to the Harcourt family unshaken despite the revelations. "Miss," he said, setting down the tray, "you sep done what none of us could. Sir Reginald would be proud." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to St. Mary Mead, where similar dramas played out in quieter ways. "Every village, every manor, has its secrets," she mused. "But they cannot hide forever. Dust settles, the truth rises." Later that day, as Miss Marple prepared to depart, she walked the gardens one last time, pausing by the fountain where the journal had been hidden. The X on the cigarette case had led her here, a beacon of Sir Reginald's foresight. She reflected on Clara's role, not a murderer, but a manipulator, her thirst for revenge as potent as Evelyn's greed or Rupert's ambition. The twist had been her orchestration, a final flourish in a deadly game, but Miss Marple's keen eye had seen through the dust to the heart of it all. At the station, Felix and Beatrice saw her off, their gratitude palpable. "Visit us again, Miss Marple," Felix said. "Dusthaven will be a different place, because of you." She smiled, boarding the train. Perhaps, Mr. Harcourt. But keep your eyes open. Human nature is never quite done surprising us. As the train pulled away, Miss Marple settled into her seat, her knitting in her lap, her mind already turning to the quiet mysteries of St. Mary Mead. The case of Dusthaven Manor was closed, but the echoes of its truths would linger, a reminder that even the smallest clue, etched in dust, could unravel the darkest secrets. And so the mystery of Dusthaven Manor concludes, with Miss Marple's keen insight bringing justice to a long-buried crime. What did you think of the final twist and the resolution of Sir Reginald's murder? Share your thoughts below and let us know where you're joining us from, perhaps a village as quaint as St. Mary Mead, or a bustling town with its own secrets. Subscribe to follow more of Miss Marple's adventures and stay tuned for the next tale of intrigue.